there during the fire? Okay. You were out there during the fires.
Uh, Not, well, we just got back last week, so
Oh, okay.
not a lot. We did see some smoke in Oregon, but we saw a lot of fire damage.
I'll bet.
And
I'll bet. Yeah.
it's just really dry out there.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it looks like that's the way we're headed for the foreseeable future. So we'll see what happens. But I was emailing with somebody in Seattle just, I think, day before yesterday, and she was dancing in her yard because it had rained. She said it was the first time it had rained in 92 days in Seattle. So it was like, holy crow. Craziness. Oh, good. Well, it's wonderful to have you participating in these kinds of things. I mean, as you can tell, we've got this growing presence and interaction with, people working on loons all over the continent.
Yeah, and hopefully my replacement will be joining us. I forwarded the information to him as well.
Oh, good. What's his name?
Bill Beatty.
Okay.
Bill Beatty.
Yeah.
So we'll see if he shows up. But yeah, I've been involved in some occupancy modeling for Wisconsin and Minnesota, so I was interested in what others are doing. Excellent.
Yeah, definitely. So have you been working with Walter Piper and data? And
I talk to him every once in a while. I'm on that science council at the National Loon Center with him.
Yeah.
And now he's got more involved and started a field project up there using some birds that I had marked color banded years ago. And so he's kind of following up there and getting things started. So yeah.
Excellent.
We got on the phone every once in a while.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, we're going to have more and more opportunities to do these collaborations across state lines and regional lines and things like that as time goes on. Yeah. I was just actually on the phone with some folks from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service here in the East this morning, Caleb Spiegel and John Stanton, who run the Atlantic Coast Marine Bird Survey Program. And they're trying to get an invigorated program up to monitor seabirds up and down the East Coast. John Stanton's going to be in charge of it. And I was talking to them about, what the little bit we've been doing with loons on the East Coast. And they've got a meeting, a virtual meeting coming up in December. And if you're interested, I can give you contact information for that. Just again, to sort of be in the loop with what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Seems like a lot of good folks with a lot of good ideas. No money, but a lot of good ideas. Yeah. Well, little by little, people are coming online. I see Nancy. I see Kathy. I see Arcada's name. Jen Denny, I don't know yet.
Mark, were you the first one here?
No, Kevin was on when I got on.
Oh. Well, I was surprised because it was all up and running before I got here. I figured Nancy did it. So how did that work?
Well, I don't know, but thank you for setting it up, Kathy.
Yeah, it's going to be more interesting next month because I might be gone depending on the day we choose.
Yeah, it sounds like you're going to be taking a break for a while.
Yes, I'm going to be in Newfoundland at the worst time it is to be in Newfoundland, and I'm so looking forward to it.
That's what I mean. Is this fun? Is this family? What's going on in Newfoundland?
Family for sure, work for sure. We've bought a second home in an outport, so we're starting to figure out how to stay there for long blocks of time.
Nice.
We're looking forward to it. The place has got 130 people on it, so we're seriously looking forward to having fewer people in our life.
I don't blame you. Yeah, it's gotten a little built up around where you are now, but yeah, definitely. Do you know Neil Burgess at all?
I know the name. He's a toxicologist.
Yeah,
right.
he worked for years and years for Environment Canada. but was in Newfoundland for the last, I don't know, 20 years of his career, and I think has retired up there.
Well, he's probably in St. John's, and our place is about as far from St. John's that you can get and still be on the island. So yeah, it's quite off the beaten track.
I gather that's easy to do in Newfoundland.
Yes, it is. I'm going to enjoy it.
Let's see.
Probably won't see any loons, unfortunately.
You may in the winter, or in migration.
Yeah, I'll have to wait and see. There's just not enough birding information in the area. I'm quite disappointed with the research that's available for it. I think I'm going to be putting a lot of information on eBird.
Interesting. I can send you Neil's email address. I mean, the address I've got for him is the town of Mount Pearl. I don't know where that is.
That's right near St. John's. And I tell you, that's 7 hours from where I will be. So 7 hours and a ferry ride. So it's, and I have Neil's email somewhere. So, but thank you.
Yeah.
Who are we waiting for?
Well, John's here.
John's here.
I see Eric. I see Jay.
Yeah, Jay might not be able to be seen. If I recall right, he said he's going to be in the car on the phone.
Indeed, I'm just starting to get back, so I apologize if I check out for a minute so I can get to my computer in the home. So good to see all of you, kinda.
And I think Vin may make it sound alike, but.
And I think Vin said he was going to try.
I got that impression. He told me he had all the information. So do you guys want to get started, or do you want to give it a couple more minutes?
I think we should start, Kathy.
Okay. Do you want me to put up that image from the survey, John, or are you good just to go?
I have one of those survey slides in on my screen that I can share. That's probably enough. And maybe if we need to, we could go back to what you have, Kathy.
Yeah, that sounds fair. So welcome, everyone. Usually John looks after the intros and stuff, but Jay does, but I will look after today. Welcome. John is going to lead us in a conversation about lake occupancy and territorial pairs, and we will go there. So everybody, welcome, and we'll turn it over to John.
Thanks, Kathy. The first challenge is just whether I can get my screen to share. And have you enabled that? Am I able to do that?
Try now. It seems like I have the right to get you started. I wasn't the first one on screen, so we'll have to see if you have any problems with that. Oh, it says I'm the host. Maybe I could just make you the host.
Let me just see. It looks like I can. Let's try this. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Yes,
Great.
thanks.
Cool. So, yeah, I think the idea here is to get us all talking about counting loans for starters, how we do that across programs, what the different ways that the programs do it is, and how we can compare those apples and oranges in some meaningful way, potentially, at a bigger scale than any one of our individual programs. So just, and the plan is to talk about not just counting loons in terms of their abundance, but also monitoring their productivity, but to leave that to subsequent meetings as far as what goes on in a loon nest and how we document that, what kind of data is collected there. And then I think beyond that, how we monitor chick survival, things like that. And what all that means. We'll talk about that later, but just in terms of counting loans, This is the survey result from the survey, Kathy, that you sent out to people across the programs in terms of what kind of data people collect. And obviously, again, for what I'm talking about today, I'm focused on that middle bar, the number of territories or occupied territories that we're seeing in the breeding populations we're monitoring, or the number of territorial pairs on a lake. So it's a really small piece of all the data we're collecting, but it's a central piece. And there's some highlights from from your slide. The motivation really for why we count loons and why we monitor adult abundance is that it's really the measure of how the population's doing, especially as we're focused on the breeding populations. And territorial occupancy is the best measure of adult abundance, because the unpaired adults, the floater population of the rogues are a lot harder to count. And that's familiar to all of us, but it's sort of beyond the scope of what I think it makes sense to focus on today. And needless to say, I'll just say from the outset that the unpaired adult loons, the floater population, and the paired adult loons, the territories that are occupied, those aren't distinct segments of the population, they're fluid. So a territorial loon today might be an evicted rogue tomorrow, or an unpaired loon today might move in and win the territory tomorrow. And when we count occupied territories, inevitably over the course of a breeding season, we're in those occupied territories, we're getting a few unpaired adults counted and vice versa. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as I talk about the scenarios that we see in New Hampshire. So it's fluid, but for today and what we're talking about today, I just want to focus on the territorial pairs. And the monitoring approaches that were covered in the bar graph from your survey, Kathy, I think can be distilled into some basic types. There's projects and research study sites that we're familiar with that really focus, usually with a trained field staff, on usually a smaller geographic area. So like Walter Piper's work in Wisconsin, or the BRI survey crews in Western Maine, or for example, the winter work, it's not territorial pairs, but the winter work at Jockasee, or the work that Judy McIntyre has done historically, focus on a really local area and is usually just using that trained staff. And then there's another brand of this monitoring that focuses on a larger area or a whole state. And the programs in Vermont, in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, the monitoring that Maine Audubon does, monitoring that Ginger and Dan do out in Washington State, the Loon Watch that happens in Wisconsin, and the census counts that happen in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. All of those are examples. Nina's work in New York State, examples of what are at least approaching a statewide count. And usually those are hybrids. They're involving a trained staff or really dedicated long-term investigators like Dan and Ginger in Washington State, as well as volunteers spread out across the lakes. And then there's national surveys like what the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey pulls together from across Canada, or and it's not used very much as far as I know in the US, but the Breeding Bird Survey does survey loons, and some of the Breeding Bird Survey data or the eBird data does get used for loon studies in the US. For the New Hampshire version of that, what I want to cover today is just the protocol that we use every year, how we've derived it, and then how that plays out, the different scenarios on the different kinds of lakes, and why we feel like that is a valid way to go about it. There's caveats for sure, but how how that protocol is validated in the data that we see. So this is the overview of over time how we have done the monitoring in New Hampshire in terms of how many territories we've surveyed, just to give you the historical perspective. And our loon counting has covered, we feel like, all of the population, especially since about 1980, when we were surveying not just the occupied territories, those are the bars in black here, where loons were present as a pair occupying a territory, but also the lakes that were suitable habitat and yet hadn't been occupied yet. So we've been trying to stay ahead of the curve here and check those lakes too. And you can see that the population, the black bars, have been growing over time. Last year, I met this guy, Bob Pike, who was the original loon crew back in 1974, before LPC was formed. And he covered all the loon pairs known, at least in the lakes region of the state. But he was the only person doing it. At this point in 2021, we're up to a crew of roughly 10 seasonal field staff and hundreds of volunteers. But we're still relying on the same basic biology. And for the territory occupancy, that's the textbook definition that we use: a pair of loons. It's displaying a pair bond, defending a territory, and doing that for at least 4 weeks. And that definition really informs how we interpret our observations throughout the season when we're assigning a pair to a lake. That's elaborated on in the species account, and so I've included an excerpt from there that, after ice out, we get a male and a female loon arriving generally within a few days of ice out and of each other, and then from ice out in late April in New Hampshire until early July, we have this window of time when we can catch them on territory, displaying that pair bond, defending the territory, and that's our time to count them. So this is from a New Hampshire lake, as at ice out, that's ice in the background, and already the pair is back. Another pair early on in the spring of them, and this is often what we're relying on seeing from our volunteers or from our surveys by mid to late May, when we have trained crew on the lakes. What you can see, even as you're driving by often, is a pair of loons cruising around the territory, patrolling it, and clearly a pair on the lake. There's subtler behaviors that our volunteers and our trained staff are oriented to, like this bill dipping, a suite of other courtship behaviors. And as we're collecting the observational data, the site surveys, we're cueing them into that as the measure of whether the pair is present and it's not just two unpaired loons on the lake. So annually at this point, as we're looking for that territorial pair behavior, we're doing it on the scale of this year 350 lakes surveyed and 520 what we call territories. Only 2/3 of those were occupied territories. So we had 326 territorial pairs counted, each on a territory. And then there were another almost a couple hundred potential suitable territories, suitable habitat that's not yet occupied. And on across those lakes, we also had roughly 130 unpaired adults. Our protocol is to divide up the territory, all the potential territories and occupied territories into tiers. So on a tier 1 lake, that's a lake that's been occupied consistently by pairs in the past. And what we're benefiting from here is not just the conspicuous behavior of loons, but also their life history, the fact that they're really faithful to a territory and that they have a high annual survival. So if they were there last year on territory, there's a 90% chance that territory is going to be active again and occupied this year. And so those are our tier 1 lakes. We survey those at least 3 times over the course of the season for an hour apiece or the equivalent. And we want to see the pair multiple times, not just once. There's a small, usually every year, a small portion of the territories that have a pair sometimes, but not enough. There's a pair there briefly, it's an ephemeral pair, and then they move on or split up or go somewhere else, and they really don't count as being resident on the territorial lake for the whole season. And we're conservative in our estimate of that. If we're missing a few pairs there that actually were present for 4 or 5 weeks, but we only saw them once and then we didn't see them again, we can't count them. We've overlooked them as an actual pair, but our consistent approach from year to year is to be conservative and not count that particular case each year. And in the first round of surveys, as our season starts in late May, we're looking for the presence or absence of that pair, and we're also already into the point where they could be nesting. This is one of our monitoring regions, the Lakes region of New Hampshire, central New Hampshire, and you can see the red dots are our tier 1 lakes, our active territories. We have a second tier that have had a pair in the past sometimes and that we're surveying closely, but we're not counting on a loon being there with as much consistency. And then our tier 3 and 4 lakes, like this purple lake here, which was not occupied in the past consistently at all, are suitable habitat, and we're checking not every year, but every few years, just to keep an eye on that segment of the habitat. But on any given one of our monitoring regions where we have a field biologist assigned, they're busy immediately doing this. And when we gave this map out this year to our Lakes Region field biologists, there was a moment of panic on their part because they were seeing all these red dots down on Lake Winnipesaukee. That's a separate monitoring region. It's just showing up on the map here. But the Lakes Region field biologist just has the smaller lakes that you'd hit with a kayak. And a given day early on in their season looks like this list down on the left here, where the 26th of May in 2019 that I have here as an example, Henry Stevens went out and surveyed several tier 3 lakes and then a bunch of the tier 1 lakes that had loon pairs on them. And these were all clustered in the western part. We call it the Wild West, but the western part of his monitoring region over here. So you can see Upper and Lower Baker Pond, Indian Pond, Arlington Lake, Tarleton Lake, and then some of the tier 3s. So that was a day in Henry's season. It was the first round of surveys to these lakes. And as he's going to these lakes in late May, he's likely to find a loon on the nest, or at least the pair present cruising around their territory. And if he doesn't, then we know that we need to look a little more closely. We're getting non-routine data. Ideally, for those lakes I just listed, or this one here in the North Country, the sort of core habitat are the lakes like Martin Meadow Pond. They're 100, 200 acres in size. They just have a single loon. And what I want to walk through is just the different scenarios. The easiest is this core habitat where we have a single pair of loons on the lake, and we call it a whole lake territory. Usually you're just going to find the pair and then maybe an intruding loon. And usually those loons will be nesting at their usual site. So they're not only faithful to the territory, they're faithful to the nest site. On this lake, you can see where the nest trap is up here. And on Google Earth, you can even see the line of signs that go out across that cove, and you can make out the nest raft itself right there. So our protocol is to check with the volunteer before we head out, arrive at the lake, scan the lake, go over and check the nest rafts. And often by late May, the loon's already sitting on the nest. And then if we don't find them there, check the other likely nest habitat. And if we don't see any loons by that point, well, we're just stumped. We paddle the entire shoreline. PES is what we put in our field notes for that. Again, what we're relying here on is just a predictable behavior of loons, that they're likely to be, exhibiting a pair bond, likely to be sitting on a nest, and really predictable year in, year out in how they do that. We're doing that as trained field staff. That's our protocol, but we're also, as the list for our survey sequence showed, calling a volunteer before we head to the lake, ideally. And on Martin Meadow Pond, as an example, in the North Country, we have this volunteer, Diane Wiles, who sends us pages and pages of her notes. And this is where our hybrid effort in New Hampshire is definitely drawing on that note-taking from Diane Wiles, or whatever form we're getting the information from volunteers on. You can see it on this volunteer form that Diane sent this year in May. This is from mid-May into June for her notes. This is page 2. Usually we get a total of something like 12 to 18 pages of notes from Diane. So that's combined with the site surveys that our field biologist is doing. And I threw in the Strava route from our North Country field biologist last year on a different lake that just shows what it means to paddle the entire shoreline. So this is our North Country field biologist not seeing any loons on the lake, paddling all along the shoreline to see if one of them is sitting on a nest. And this is our survey data from Martin Meadow Pond, that original pond where we had Diane Wiles' notes to go on, of what our field biologist Owen saw this year. In late May, as he went on his first survey to the lake, the 2 adult loons were there on the lake, but they weren't nesting yet. There weren't any intruding loons. So his incubation was no, and his pair bond, the behaviors we're looking for, was yes. And then on his second survey in late June, the pair was present again. And when he went to look at the raft, they were incubating on the raft. And his third survey showed that they were still there, the pair, and had 2 chicks hatch. So this is like clockwork. This is great. This is what we hope will happen as we're going to survey the lakes, because then the 3 visits that we need to confirm this data, it's really pretty sufficient. I think what's not on here was Owen's 4th survey in August to confirm the survivorship of the chicks. But this was in the end, the final data report that Owen filled out for the lake in terms of pair occupancy. He assigned the lake to paired adults, they nested, and then he has some comments about that and about the Diane Wiles keeps great track of the loons. Again, this is like the core habitat, the easiest kind of lake to monitor, and the most straightforward case. It gets a little more complicated if we're looking at lakes where there's multiple lakes in a single territory, or what we call multiple lake territory. So usually a smaller pond, hatch pond here, the southern lake on this map is only 20 or 30 acres, I think. It's one of the smaller lakes where we have a nesting pair of loons, and the loons move between Hatch Pond and Crystal Lake. So here's the nest sites over the last 10 years on the raft on Hatch Pond. And you can see, again, in Google Earth, you can see the raft and the sign that goes out there. And what we have seen between Crystal Lake and Hatch Pond over the years for paired adult loons is in this table here on the left. You can see that usually from 2008 on, we've had a pair of loons on Hatch Pond and no loons assigned to Crystal Lake. So 0 in 08, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. 13, we had a second pair on Crystal Lake. 14, we're back to just 1 pair on Hatch. And then things got a little different from 2015 to 2017, where we ended up with a pair on Crystal and not on Hatch. In 2014, I've got a picture here of Janelle and Tori rescuing the territorial male from Hatch Pond. And he did not survive that rescue and rehab. So we lost the pair on Hatch Pond, or the paired adult. And there was a new, in 2015, 2016, there was kind of a shakeup or turnover in the pairs. And they sort of switched their allegiance and started hanging out more on Crystal. And then in 2019, we lost the female loon from Hatch Pond as a mortality. And there was a new female that in her place, and they were again over on Crystal Lake moving around, and then settled back into nesting on the raft in the last couple of years. So we're tracking closely the territorial occupancy across those two lakes, because they're using both lakes, and because in some years we actually do have two pairs. But the problem is that if you talk to the locals on Crystal Lake, they're seeing loons. And if you talk to the locals on Hatch Pond, they're seeing loons. And in some years, the locals on Crystal Lake will claim that they have their own pair, even though what they're seeing is just the pair of loons from Hatch Pond foraging on Crystal Lake. And our job in our surveys and in the reports we're getting from them is to tease that out. So the 3 1-hour surveys we do, if we're careful, may tease that out. But we've also, in our protocol, adopted the strategy of making sure we're making multiple visits to a lake like Crystal Lake. That's a tier 2 lake, but where if we see loons there on the first visit and we want to establish their residency, we need to go back there several times. And we need to square the local reports we're getting from both lakes with the institutional memory that's here in our data and in the knowledge of our permanent staff to guide the seasonal staff and say, hey, if you are you sure, did you check both lakes as you went and surveyed? If we just went to one or the other lake, we wouldn't have the full picture. The other thing that's, in terms of our hybrid program, become more systematic in recent years is that we're working with trained volunteers to go to both lakes at once. So in this case, for these 2 ponds in the Lakes region of New Hampshire, we're now working with a local conservation group, the Tin Mountain Conservation Center, or Tin Mountain Nature Center, and they have a loon program, and they have dedicated roving loon volunteers who are monitoring these lakes with us. And those volunteers know to go, and sometimes are teaming up in tandem to survey both of these lakes at once. So that's for a multiple lake loon territory, some of the nuance to our monitoring there.
I just had a quick question. Are all of your territorial pairs banded?
I chose this example because it's a Lakes region lake where we have banded loons. And so for example, this loon in the picture here that is being rescued was a banded male loon that had been banded the year prior to that rescue. But that's only true for about, maybe 15 to 30% of the breeding population in the Lakes region of New Hampshire. And for our, it might be approaching that we have, 150 to 200 banded loons in the breeding population. And we have about 600 to 800 loons total in the breeding population, if you include the unpaired adult loons. So we're approaching a quarter of the population that's banded. So no, and I chose Martin Meadow Pond, where Diane Wilds is our trusted volunteer in the North Country. As an example, that on that lake, we have one banded adult loon at this point, although for years and years we had the pair banded. So it's hit or miss, Erica. That's a good question. It makes it easier when we're trying to tease it out, but it's probably a quarter to a third of the lakes or territories at this point. And it really varies depending on the region of the state. We tend to focus our banding around, just logically around, geographically around us at the Loon Center. So the other version of that, the other version of the monitoring that we're doing is the big lakes. We have 5 geographic monitoring regions of small lakes, and then the 4 biggest lakes in the state have dedicated surveys or field biologists assigned to them. And Winnipesaukee is the largest lake at 42,000 acres. At this point, almost 30 pairs of loons. Historically, like the rest of the state, it's gone from many fewer pairs on up. So back, the guy whose picture I showed at the beginning, Bob Pike, who started in 1974, is the only loon field biologist. I think he had a small handful, just maybe 5 or 10 pairs to count, and maybe 2-3 chicks to count on the whole lake. And over time, we've tracked the growth to approaching 30 pairs of loons. And the named loon territories that you can see on this map are the places on the lake where we've seen year after year pair activity. But it's an enormous job to try and cover all the potential habitat on the lake.
Sure is, John.
Go ahead.
I'm just agreeing. It is a heck of a job to survey all that.
Yes. And you can see this little hey, a shout out to Ben here. You can see this little spike on our trend over time here is the year that Vin started on the lake. And then I think 2009, and then the year after his second year on the lake. So we could go into the before and after effect there, but certainly that spike and Vin's tenure here as a field biologist was, coincided with, for me, the time when we were really sorting out how best to go about this and to make sure that we were accurately capturing territory occupancy on a large lake. So to illustrate that, I just want to focus on this year's 2021 monitoring for a handful of these territories. And this is the close-up look at Buzzell's Cove here and Poplar Island and Gun Island, where I think when Vin was monitoring 2009, 2010, we actually had a nesting pair on Gun Island. But this is a part of the lake that we're crisscrossing almost every day in the course of our surveys. Just to go back, the Loon Center is located up at the north end of the lake, and our monitoring route is to cruise down the lake and get out around the lake to the different sections of the lake on a daily basis. We're basically trying to cover the whole lake on average each week. And so we're crossing through this area almost daily. And that means that instead of 3 one-hour visits over the whole season, we might have 10 or 20 visits. And usually we're going to have at least 10 or 12 visits where we're really dedicating some time to the territory. And the problem here is that the loons can move around much more easily. We don't just have one single lake that they're on, and we're not going to find that pair on territory every time. So we're using generally the same kind of survey data that I showed you for Owen surveys of Martin Meadow Pond, but on Winnipesaukee, we're tracking it against the neighboring territories with this lake log. And this is just a sort of cheat sheet we use, a table that we fill out in Excel as a spreadsheet or by hand. And we had a couple field staff this year on the lake, so they were sharing a single hard copy of this, and it was living in the office here. And you can see for this week in late June, and the list here showing neighboring territories, Buzzell's Cove, Poplar Island, and Gun Island here, what they were seeing as they were headed out through those territories. You can see some days like 28th, 29th of June, we had no loons on those territories. But then the 4th of July, there was a pair of loons, 2 paired adults, and the 3rd loon at Buzzell's Cove here, and a pair of loons at Poplar Island, and then just one loon over at Gun Island. And what we're doing as we interpret that data is looking over the course of the whole season at how often we were seeing a pair in each of those places. Again, what we have helping us is that a lot of these pairs of loons are nesting, and then we immediately know that it's a pair for sure. So this year in Buzzell's Cove, there was a nest. At Poplar Island, there was not a nest. And what made things interesting here was that at the beginning of the season, a volunteer who lives right down on Molten Burrow Neck here called us and was seeing a pair of loons poking around a little island right outside Buzzell's Cove here. And in fact, as we did our surveys, we were sometimes seeing a pair of loons here as well as in Buzzell's Cove. In the end, this ended up being an ephemeral pair. They weren't there long enough to count, but it's the sign of things to come probably, and we're going to have to pay close attention going into next year to catch pair activity or a nest as that's established on this section of the lake. And what Griffin, our field biologist, ended up assigning here for territory boundaries was roughly a territory like this for Buzzell's Cove, a territory like this for Poplar Island, no loons assigned to Gun Island, and then up here in this section of the lake, the beginnings of a pair at this little island, Mara Island right here. And there's another territory up at the end of the map here, the north end of the map, that we probably would have overlooked as a pair, except that we stumbled on the nest in the usual spot in late July. Very inconspicuous nest site. We found the bird on the nest, and prior to that, we'd just been seeing a single loon in the territory. So on a bigger lake, we're counting on repeated visits, close checks of the nesting habitat to pick up on the pair activity, but it's a whole different ball of wax. That's really the three different main types, though. The whole lake territory like Martin Meadow Pond, the multi-lake territory like Hatch Pond and Crystal Lake, or the partial lake territory where the loon territory is only part of the giant lake. And that's how we treat the observational data. And often as we analyze it, we separate out those kinds of habitat. But in terms of monitoring strategy, there's a really different approach on each of those. And what I want to talk about lastly is just how we are hoping and thinking that those methods, those various strategies are valid and accurate across the years and across, for us, the state of New Hampshire. And a lot of that is hindsight. We can know after the fact that we can look back at what we've seen on individual territories and know that we've actually were correct in what we were thinking, that if the folks on Crystal Lake and Eaton told us they had a pair the year before, but we thought it was just one pair moving between Crystal and Hatch, that yeah, in hindsight, when we've gotten a set of volunteers out to both lakes or did really close surveys ourselves, we really are confident that it's just a single pair of loons moving between the two lakes. Or that, you know, in the end, the loon pair did eventually start nesting. We're also just, for validation, relying on the loon biology, that loons are faithful to the territory year after year, that 2/3 of the pairs we monitor usually nest, and that, you know, a little better than half of those nesting pairs produce chicks. That means that over time, we're going to pick up on a pair of loons, even if we overlook them in a given year. As long as we keep checking that lake year after year, sooner or later, that pair of loons is likely to nest, and sooner or later, that nest is likely to succeed. So over the 5 to 10 year time frame, our chances of overlooking a pair diminish. And then we see consistency in our data over time and among the subpopulations or monitoring regions that we're covering. So the trends we see over time, the demographic parameters we're monitoring, they don't tend to wobble around over time. And I just want to show you, to close, I just want to show you a couple of graphs that illustrate that. Again, this is the state of New Hampshire on the right here and the monitoring regions we use. And this box plot is a little cryptic maybe, but it's the proportion of territorial pairs that nest. And again, as we are counting loons, as we're counting pairs of loons and assigning them to territories, as soon as we have evidence of a nest, we're gold, because there's definitely a pair of loons if they've laid an egg. And the nest is easier to find and document. And once you found an egg or eggshells, you know it was there for the year. And so if we look at the proportion of pairs that nest, we want that to be consistent. We want it to be consistent with what we expect and with what we've seen in the past for a given monitoring region. And this set of box plots here shows you for each of the monitoring regions, the red dot, this is data for 2020, the red dot is the nesting propensity for 2020. And the box plot itself shows you the solid bar is the average over the last 15 years. And then the box around that is the spread of the data, or the range of the data, the quartiles of the data. So the 25th percentile, the 75th percentile, and the outliers are the whiskers on the box plot. That's just showing you the range of data that we see. And so for the Lakes region of New Hampshire, the furthest left box on this box plot, that's the central part of the state. And you can see that about 70% on average of the pairs usually nest. And then in 2020, it was really similar to that. And what we're looking for here is we check the data and validate it for a given year, is whether these red dots, the annual data, stick to the usual trend we see. And you can see that the Lakes region compared to MD down on the horizontal axis here is for Monadnock, that's the southwestern part of the state. NC is for North Country, SC is for Seacoast, SU is for Sunapee. These all have about the same number of pairs of loons. And there's differences among those regions year in, year out. So we tend to see a lower nesting propensity in the North Country here than in the Lakes region. And that may be that we have a harder time detecting the nests in the North Country. Maybe they nest early and fail, and we're just overlooking failed nest attempts. So it could be an artifact of our method, could be sampling error, or it could be that there's just more, the North Country subpopulation is closer to carrying capacity. There's more density dependent pressure on paired loons, and so they're just more likely to be distracted from nesting by an intruding loon. And so it could be a variety of things, but what, excuse me for a sec. What we're looking for is to see whether the annual data, 2020 in this case, that red dot, follows the trend, and whether the North Country was a little bit lower in 2020 than Monadnock and a little bit lower than Lakes region, the same average. And you can see across all of the different regions here that indeed it was. It's really interesting to see how year in, year out, usually the annual nesting propensity follows these geographic trends that we see among regions. It's just reassuring us that there wasn't a lot of wobble to the data that we could assign to the field biologist missing a bunch of nests. Or on the other hand, if you look at the right-hand side of the box plots, this is Squam, Onondaga, and Winnipesaukee. These boxes are a little bigger because they're smaller sample sizes. There's just more variability for these individual big lakes. And they tend to move around, but when you see a year like 2020 on Squam Lake, where the nesting propensity was really high, upwards of 80 or 90% of the pairs nested. You want to know why that happened, why that was different than usual. Maybe it was just a blip. Or on Winnipesaukee, if that was also a year when it was higher than average. If it's a new field biologist on Winnipesaukee, you want to make sure again that they weren't overlooking pairs, or if it was a very low nesting propensity, they might be overlooking nests. But there could also be something going on the lake that's just of note biologically. And that's the kind of validation that we can do as we're looking at the data at the end of the season and looking at the data over time. So the other way that that plays out is just that, and I am almost done here, it's just that we can look at the trends among regions over the long historical time and be reassured that our pair counts are showing similar trends among regions. So this graph shows you on the vertical axis in red and black the number of paired adult loons each year for Lake Umbagog in red. This was prepared for a close look at Umbagog, and for the rest of the northern subpopulation. And then in gray, and it's on a separate vertical scale shown on the right, all the rest of the state, which is the majority of the population. But what's notable here is that the pair counts we were doing in those three places really follow each other closely. So there's not the sense that our method or the way we're doing it is missing some trend or artificially showing a trend that's not really there. The trend is the same on Umbagog, on North Country, and in the rest of the state. And when there's differences like the crash on Umbagog from 2000 to 2002, we're more confident that that's really something going on there. It was, I mean, it's a big enough difference on Umbagog that there's no debating that it actually is a real event in the population. But one of the questions that came up as that happened was whether the loons on Umbagog had simply shifted to other lakes. Maybe there's a lack of prey or something. And what you can see if you look closely at the North Country in those several years is that we saw a similar trend there in pair abundance, where we were losing pairs on the North Country lakes. So it wasn't that the Umbagog loons were just moving elsewhere in the neighboring North Country lakes. We were really actually maybe seeing something was happening to those loons across the board beyond Umbagog. But again, it's reassuring to look at this graph and see that the method we're using to count paired adult loons seems to hold up when you compare over the years and among regions. So that's in a long nutshell, our protocol, the differences we see for different habitat types. I'm hoping that it can be a little bit how we're pulling on different volunteer sources on these different lakes and some of the approaches we're using to validate it. And I'm hoping that as I'm describing and looking closely at New Hampshire lakes and our methods, that I'm just lighting up a lot of the ways that are familiar to everybody else in whether you're using strictly volunteer data or strictly trained field staff, that there's a huge amount of overlap. And as we'd be comparing or looking for ways to standardize, we'd be starting to look at some of these nuances to how the data are collected. So I've gone on for much longer than I had hoped to, but I hope it's generated some questions and grounds for discussion.
Thank you very much, John. That was really good. A question for folks. That had a lot of information in it. I'm wondering if I'm pretty certain that this is going to have to continue to next week to get the conversation done well enough. What are people's thoughts on this? We have a quick roundtable now, but continue it next month as well. Do you feel that we should do that to get everybody's thoughts in on this? but maybe wave your hand or,
Yes, Kathy.
yep, okay,
Yeah, I agree.
all right.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.
So, all right, so now at least we know what we're doing next week, next time. Also, we have new faces as well. What do you guys think about just for today? Everybody just says hello and maybe tells us where they're from and then giving us one bit of difference in between John's program and theirs. Does that sound like a good way to go through today? John likes that idea. Okay, well, since I'm talking anyways, I can start. Kathy Jones, I'm the volunteer coordinator for many programs at Birds Canada, including the Canadian Lakes Loon Survey. And I saw a lot of eerily familiar things with John's survey where much of his information is collected in the same format. But I see the biggest difference is the intensity of the survey, where I think there's much more training and much more time is focused on ensuring the volunteer commitment is there. And I'm very curious of that pair bond field, which is something I would love to hear more about later. So anybody else ready to talk?
Yeah, sure. I can go next. My name is Jen Denny, and I work for Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation with Nina Schock. And this is my second time joining in this conversation, but it's been a while. So my role is education coordinator, and also volunteer coordination falls underneath that hat. So I am kind of involved in helping recruit people for our volunteer census. We certainly do. We have a pretty well-established field staff that helps to keep track of how many pairs we have on our study lakes. And that gives us a general overall feel for the amount of pairs that we have across the Adirondacks, although it is purely an estimate, an informed estimate, but an estimate. But one of the really interesting things that I noticed from the presentation was how often the amount of effort that it takes to get an accurate count on Winnipesaukee. We have, for example, Upper Saranac Lake. I should have ran and looked up the acreage on Upper Saranac and the size. It's a large lake. It's 8 miles long, not the size of Winnipesaukee, but it is large. And we had 56 loons counted there this year during the census. And everybody says that it's very, very high, but the people who surveyed it were very experienced surveyors. So we don't think that there was a lot of duplication going on. They were well coordinated. So I'd be interested just to see as time goes on, if we could implement something like you've done in New Hampshire, to figure out how many of those loons are simply visiting, are they intruding, or are they actual pairs that are nesting there? Because I'm sure the number would be different.
Thanks, Jen. I'm just trying to think how to go through this. I'm just going to call out people in my list and in the order I have them. Dana, you're next. Do you have anything to add?
I am a volunteer that's working with LPC, with John. John and I have lots of fun together during the summer and other times. And then I am also coordinating the Tin Mountain Conservation Group that he spoke about, that was working with the, particularly that Crystal and Hatch Lake scenario that he had. And I just have lots of questions, particularly why is it that it seems that a third of our loons are not, although they may be territorial pairs, they're not nesting. And that's a very significant question to me as to why that is. And is there anyone doing any research as it relates to that issue?
Is that something we want to leave till after everybody talks, and I'll just make a question of it? Yep. Okay. All right. So next would be Mark. You're up.
Hi, I think I know almost everybody on the call. I'm sort of loosely associated with many of your groups. I'm a retired wildlife veterinarian, and I guess I try and help people figure out why loons die. So, I'm not doing a lot of field work on live loons, but I'm assisting with some of the field work on dead loons.
All right, next in my strange order, as people I think called onto the program, is my apology if I don't pronounce this right, Arcata?
Yep, you got it right, Kathy. It's Arcata. Hi, everyone. I think I've met maybe half of you at this point, but I'm an associate wildlife biologist with the Ricketts Conservation Foundation out here in Wyoming. And we are doing monitoring of the small compared to what you guys have GYE loon population. So John, it was great to hear your talk. I see a lot of similarities between the way that we collect data. I think that's due in large part to everything I know about loons is I've learned from Vin, and I think he learned a lot from you as well. But yeah, excited to keep talking about it next time.
Arcata, this is Mark. Just to be a translator here, for those of you in the East who haven't been out in that area, GYE is the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem.
Yes, thank you, Mark.
So next in our list is, well, I had Jay. Jay, you might as well go next since that's who I was thinking of.
I'm Jay Mager. I teach at Ohio Northern University. I've been able to study loons for about 30 years now. I've been working a lot with behavioral ecology, and so I have been looking at more sort of focused sort of local populations that have been studied pretty intensely, whether it be in New York, Michigan, or Wisconsin. But recently I've been trying to do some work looking at the utilization of wintering habitat by loons. And I'm very much interested in perhaps getting more information from this group on how to better survey wintering populations of loons, particularly in freshwater environments. John, that presentation was outstanding. I guess one question I had was I was kind of interested in the separation between tier 3 and tier 4 lakes, and how do you use these different tier lakes to perhaps come up with your annual, census data? Do you treat them differently because of the different frequencies at which you survey those lakes? And sort of as an overall sort of question among all of the people that do surveys with respect to lake occupancy and territoriality and breeding pairs, how do you control, or how do we figure out a way in which maybe we can make all of our data work in terms of finding sort of a common protocol for lakes that we survey at different frequencies. Tier 1 through tier 4 is a really interesting way, I think, by which John's doing it, and perhaps thinking about ways to sort of, I don't know the right word is correct, but try to make sure that we accommodate differences in sampling frequencies and coming up with maybe generalizations about pair occupancies. I talk too much, but it's good to see everybody.
Jay, this is Mark, and I talk more than you do probably, but let me just interject one thing. You were talking about wintering populations, and I was chatting with Kevin before some of the other folks got on relative to this. I was on a Zoom this morning with some folks from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service who are interested in sort of enlarging and reconstituting some studies of coastal bird mortality on the East Coast and Gulf Coast over the winter. And Jay, you and I still need to have a Zoom.
That'd be great. And I think I see a retired Kevin Keno out there. So welcome, Kevin. I'm sure you'll be able to speak next. But it's really good to see your face, Kevin.
And for anybody who's interested in this issue of coastal bird mortality, I think I sent around to some of you on December 7th, 8th, and 9th. There's going to be a Zoom session run by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and National Marine Fisheries Service on coastal seabirds. And I think the discussion that we want to be part of with loons is going to be on the 7th. So I'll send out some more information about that.
I like how now Zoom is a verb. We have a Zoom. So John, do you want to hold off on that question and just collect questions for now?
Yeah, I think what I'm realizing, Kathy, is that having talked for so long, it may be helpful to just, I'm noting down some questions, and I might be able to, we might be able to get some answers out.
Yeah, if I can interject, the whole idea was throwing that question out yet, John, is that maybe we talk about it next month, and that you have it on the radar, because I really applaud what you've all done.
Something I will note on that is I thought it was kind of cool, particularly since I'm also involved with woodcock surveys, and they have an unoccupancy group that they survey every 5 years. So I know there's other people use the same technique. So I am quite intrigued to see. I don't do analysis, but I'm very intrigued by that idea. So who's next on my list? Bill Beatty?
Hello, I am a research wildlife biologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in La Crosse, Wisconsin. I am actually a co-principal investigator on the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project, and we had just wrapped up the first field season for that project in August, and really appreciate the presentation, John. I see a lot of similarities into how we surveyed loons this past summer, so that's really encouraging. As we just heard, one of the major differences is that we had a very focused study area with just a very small number, a relatively small number of lakes, and so we did not split anything into tiers. We got to hit all the lakes consistently. So this project was really envisioned and spearheaded by Kevin. So I'm just not retired, so I do all the paperwork for him, so he can go outside and find loons.
Somebody's got to do all the paperwork, right?
Yeah.
All right. So thank you, Bill. Who's next on my list? Caroline?
Hi, I'm Caroline Hughes. I'm a biologist at LPC with John in New Hampshire. So I help to coordinate our field program, and I'm also in charge of our education initiatives and our volunteer coordination.
Hi, Carolyn. Next is Emily.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. I work with Nina and Jen at the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation, and I'm a biologist, and this was my first field season. So it's exciting to meet all the volunteers and see, how we conduct our surveys and everything like that.
All right, who am I missing here? Eric, do you want to have any comments about any of this or want to share anything?
Eric, your sound is off.
So I coordinate the Vermont Center for Eco Studies project in Vermont, where we have much smaller number of lakes. So it's more, like a small region compared to Minnesota. But I rely pretty much totally on volunteers to do the bulk of the survey work. And I would say maybe half of my volunteers are out there quite a bit into detecting pair, nest failures, success, chicks through August. I have a whole slew of other volunteers who get out, just a handful of times random. And that's where I and my assistant come in as, we'll be doing the follow-ups on those or even taking the lead on those with those single surveys, those random surveys, those less reliable ones, just sort of complementing what we're seeing. And pretty much every week or two, I go through my, known territory list. And it's like, okay, where have we been in the last 2 weeks? Where have we not been in the last 2 weeks? And that prioritizes where we send either myself or my assistant, or I'm actually really building up this thing I've called focused loon surveys. And I put out the list of what we're looking for. And I probably have about 10 volunteers who have just latched onto that. And they are just cruising the state, checking all these lakes where we have not been. And this is just really the first year I've really pushed that. And I think it's going to really build up because there's a lot of people out there just looking for a place to explore. So it's kind of a neat way to do that and hit those needs. It means assessing your data all the time. You can't just sort of look at it at the end of the season. You're looking at it constantly throughout, where have you been? I think one of the trickiest things to deal with is the new pairs forming and, making, how do you, potential habitat and how many surveys you need to get there to confirm, do we have a new pair? Do we not have a new pair? And that's going to influence that nesting propensity data. Like we didn't have that many new pairs show up this year, but is that because we just didn't get to those lakes enough to document, yes, we got a pair over 4 weeks or 6 weeks. And so they don't show up? Not really sure. So that's definitely one of those little nuances to figure out and looking at nesting versus just pairs that are not nesting. Especially if there's no history of nesting. If there's a history of nesting, a single survey might confirm, oh yeah, there's the two. They're not on the nest the next time. They're not on the nest the next time. They may not even be there. but it's those unknown ones that are forming, or the ones that disappear, that can be a little trickier.
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm very curious about how you manage to stay on top of that. I'm assuming you're using online data entry.
I'm going to hopefully be spending this winter evaluating all of your programs and all your data entry. And we have actually designated funding this next year to build a system for that volunteer input. No, because it's all been email and phone calls. It's really bad of how much time it takes me.
I would love to be able to visit all my Loon sites. That would be really a fun
Yeah.
decade.
But one of the things, I'm glad you brought up the online entry. And looking at all the ways we do it, I have a lot of people who go out there every day, every week, and they're just shooting data. So we don't need the super detail of the weather, partial lake. I mean, so I'm looking at trying to build this form where there's multiple, or at least 2 different categories, where one is just, what's the pair up to if you're following that pair, and then have the option of adding in that detail that was on that big list that Kathy had, or John showed at the beginning, of all those other types of data we're going to collect. And so that might be what I and my field staff would do. We'd fill those out completely. We may have a few volunteers who want to fill it completely, but having the option of, because I have a lot of people who we use eBird, and they're just scared away from that. It's too complicated. You want someone who can go on, do something in 10 seconds to enter that data and get it to me. They don't want 5 minutes or 10 minutes of having to do this, because it's going to just prevent people from wanting to partake. And loons are great because you don't have to be a wildlife expert. And a lot of them are not that birder type who would love to take 10 minutes and fill in all the data about every bird they saw and where they saw it. It's a whole different mentality of the person who lives on a lake casually, has a cabin, but likes to follow their pair. And just even get them to enter data or call me is tough. So to figure out a really, really simple methodology for that is going to be key to the way I build this thing.
Yes, it will be. And I can tell you the pros and cons if you ever want to have that conversation. We should
I
move
will.
down. We should move down the list though, because we have a lot of people we haven't got to. Billy Helprin. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
You got it right, Kathy. Billy Helprin. Yep, I'm the director of the Sones Maynell Wildlife Sanctuary, which is on Mount Desert Island on the coast of Maine. And we have a pretty targeted area with maybe up to 11 territories or so on multiple lakes. And so we're able to follow the loons as they arrive and stay with them all the way until they leave, which sometimes is well into December from the lakes, and just head to the ocean, which is obviously close by. We have a lot of intruding loons that visit they might be just over in the ocean, which is so close. So it's easy for them to visit and try to work on getting a territory. But we follow some of these pairs every day. So we have really close watch on the vast majority of them, and especially if they're nesting or they have eggs or chicks. And there's a big volunteer group that I coordinate, and so I get all the emails and photos and questions about all the different pairs all throughout the whole year. So it's a little different than what some of the bigger groups have to deal with, but it's working well to keep track of things.
Great to hear about. We're going to keep going. We want to have a good 5 minutes to discuss what we're doing next. So next person on the list, Erica, would you like to share?
I'm Eric Lemoyne. I run the Loon Watch program out of Northland College in Ashland, Wisconsin. So we're Project Loon Watch. It's region-wide, about 27 northern Wisconsin counties, totally volunteer driven. And yeah, I think I'll end it there just to keep things short. But it's interesting to hear like the different capacities that people have and what you're all able to accomplish. We are monitoring, or I'm asking volunteers ideally to monitor from ice out through migration productivity information. So when did the loons arrive, nest, did the chicks hatch, did the chicks survive to 8 weeks, which is what we define as probably going to survive to fledge. So that's kind of in a nutshell, but there's a whole lot of other data that I collect too, I ask them to collect floater information. So I know that John, you said you don't collect that, but we're sort of interested in that because some of the data that Walter is collecting and what Mike has collected in the past sort of indicate that floaters can really influence territorial pairs. And so just out of curiosity, we're collecting that, probably collect way more than we need to in terms of data, but I think more is better. And then we can go back and look at it. Right now, I'm trying to go back and look at data going back to 1978. So
thanks, Erica. Yeah, I think in your area and our area, floaters becoming more of a something to watch than a lot of groups have been doing it. And we're just trying to figure out as well how we're going to deal with that in the future. Next on the list is Jillian. Do you mind chatting, or are you able to, Jillian?
Yeah, I'm here. Hi. Hi, my name is Jillian Whitney, and I work for the DCR down here in Massachusetts. I've been monitoring loons for about 17 years, and Mark let me know about this group. And although I only have about 4 volunteers, I was curious to see how everybody organizes theirs and what sort of data they collect. And also, after listening to John's talk, I'm very interested to hear how folks are collecting data on floaters, because we are definitely starting to see a lot more down here in Mass, and not quite sure how to keep track of them or get an accurate number. So thank you for letting me listen in. And
yep. One of the things that Jillian has told me in the past too is the bodies of water that Jillian monitors are largely reservoirs supervised by a state agency in Massachusetts, and they used to freeze over every winter. And you know, we'd have deer die out there and the eagles would come down and eat them and things like that. And Jillian, I remember you saying to me just in the last year or two that more and more of those bodies of water are staying open, and you've had loons wintering over in central Massachusetts there, which I thought was really interesting.
yes, we definitely see them a lot later. I think last year Wachusett did freeze over for a very brief period, but Quabbin did not. But definitely when I'm out we do gull roost counts over the winter, I'm seeing a lot more loons sticking around.
Yeah.
That's actually very interesting. We of course we still have a lot of areas freezing, but we're noticing later freezing. So loons are staying later in many of our areas. Kevin, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Kevin Keno, emeritus with the U.S. Geological Survey, research wildlife biologist, and have been studying loons for many years in various aspects of the biology. More recently interested in surveys, setting up surveys, and I'm doing some occupancy modeling of some work that from surveys that Mike Meyer and I did in Wisconsin years ago. So the information you provided today, John, was relevant, and thanks for laying it out so clearly. As Bill mentioned, we're involved in a effort in Minnesota now, and Bill graciously lets me go out in the field a few weeks last summer, so that was nice. It's great to see so many faces and names. Hi, Nina. So I guess I had a couple questions I'll just pop out there that I wrote down. Regarding the tier levels, how many years of data do you feel like you need to collect on a territory before you can assign it to a tier category? And the other thing is, do you see any patterns in detectabilities of detection probabilities of pairs? You mentioned something with respect to nest sites, perhaps, or finding nests in northern lakes. Those lower detection probabilities. I wondered if you saw something like that with pairs as well, and if there are any patterns in terms of the type of lakes that you're looking at and how that impacts detection probability. Thanks for letting me join, and thanks for the invitation, Mark.
Okay, terrific. Thank you. I've marked down that question to John. I think you probably have as well. Nancy, did you want to share? Nancy Sheehan?
Yes, hi everybody. Nice to see you all and meet new people. I'm the program coordinator for Journey North, which is a migratory species citizen science program with the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I'm calling in from Madison, Wisconsin. Nice to see other Wisconsin folks here. I'm in the process of revising and rethinking Journey North. Currently, Journey North only asks volunteers from across Canada, North America for first arrival dates. So I'm curious how crowdsourced, broad scale citizen science program can augment the kind of more regional, very specific, local specific surveys that you're all doing. So interested in that spring migration, but also, as Jay was mentioning, how to bring in the power of the crowd to ascertain the presence of loons during winter months. Journey North is particularly well suited for general public, the crowd out there. So as Eric was mentioning, it's very easy entry, data entry portal and secure data website. And so I'm right now, there are 18 different projects I manage for Journey North, and the Common Loons is one of them. But very excited to hear how you all are doing what you're doing and hearing how Journey North might assist in your efforts. So nice. Thanks, John, for your great presentation.
Thanks, Nancy. Nina, are you still with us, Nina?
I am. I'm here. Sorry. Hold on a second. Start up my computer. So as Emily and Jen said, I coordinate the Adirondack Center for Loon Conservation, and I've been studying loons in the park, Adirondack Park, since 1998, along with the help of many of you on this call. Basically, I set up the program very quickly in 2001, thanks to the people at LPC at the time. And we basically used the same monitoring techniques, converting the H to a Y in all the forms that in like 10 days of getting all the data. And now we have a set of about 100 study lakes we monitor, some on a weekly basis, some on an intermittent basis throughout the summer. And we're looking for the banded loons and also unbanded reproductive success. And then we're continuing the banding field work, 10 to 20 birds a year. So, and now I'm trying to impart all my knowledge over to Jen and Emily and a couple other people so that they can carry on when I eventually retire down the road. Following in Kevin's footsteps.
So he was the first, and then there's a whole bunch of us are kind of lining up and waiting for our day.
Yeah.
Yes. I've got the countdown started, but it's a few years. Robin, do you mind sharing with us? Oh, maybe we lost Robin already. Did we? Yes, we did.
Okay, I can give you a brief background. Robin is the vice president of the Toddy Pond Association, so a lake association here in Maine, and they have not done any significant work on loons on that lake, but they're about to form a loon study committee and get to some work both on that lake and coordinating with Maine Audubon Society. And she was emailing me, and I told her about the meeting and invited her to join the group. And Billy, I told her she should be in touch with you to see what you're doing on Mount Desert Island too. So, yep.
Cool, very cool. And last but not least, and if I've missed somebody, let me know. Vin, are you still with us, Vin?
I am. Hey, everybody. Yeah, Vincent Spagnolo, as John mentioned, I got my start with Loon Preservation Committee. And then I was the Loon Program Director for Biodiversity Research Institute. And more recently, have been working with the Ricketts Conservation Foundation out in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem, as many of you on the call here, I think, know, I've recently left my position with RCF and am working with them sort of in a limited adjunct capacity going forward. But I'm still sort of a little bit involved with some aspect of loons. That's once you're in as deep as all of us have kind of gotten in, it's a little hard to, fully extract yourself. So it's exciting to still sort of play a little bit of role in things like this group. And things are, have been passed off to Arcata, who's now leading the charge out in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So yeah, it's just fun to be a part of things like this and sort of throw my knowledge into the ring as needed. John, great presentation. It's fascinating. It's always great to see all your data sort of being shown, and your methods are the methods that we've adapted to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, with some slight differences based on the size and type of the population out there, and sort of some of the challenges logistically in getting surveys done. And Arcata can always fill and will fill more information in on that as things go forward. The areas that I'm sort of most interested in are, with your experiences and others who have a much larger population than the GYE, these sort of instances where you're sort of on the fence about, is this a pair or not a pair? And what are those factors that really kind of push you over one side or the other, or sort of what's the absolute, sort of minimum comfort level you have for calling a pair, especially with, territory history, or I forget if someone was mentioning, these instances where you're having a pair in a lake for a first time, and maybe you're seeing either a new pair or recolonization, and sort of your experience in determining, is this just two adults? Is this, the start of a pair? Yeah, just generally interesting to see how the discussion will address those factors, because we face that a lot in the GYE, as we've had a rapidly recovering population from about 14 pairs now up to about 25, with likely more on the way and plenty of habitat still to fill or recolonize. Thanks.
That's great. And I hear you coming from there. We often wonder on some of our big lakes how to explain to volunteers how to tell pairs, and it's so complex at times. I'm sure John can speak to that. So that's everybody who's in attendance. What's next on our agenda? We're going to leave a lot of the roundtable and go over that late next week. Do we want to discuss when we plan to meet next time? Are we in a good place? Oh, Mark likes that idea. You guys want to stick with Wednesdays? Do you want to go back to Mondays? Is there a time that works best? Do we need a doodle poll, or any thoughts?
I would think for the size group, maybe a doodle poll would be helpful.
Okay.
I do like Kathy having a consistent day, monthly date.
Yes, so that we can all plan ahead. And I know I'm the wrench for the next one. I'm not going to apologize for it either.
No, I feel like I'm the one who pushed this meeting to Wednesday, since I teach a class from 2 to 5 on Mondays, and when we usually have these meetings at 4 o'clock on the last Monday of the month. And I don't mind doing that, in the future, because this semester will be over soon, and there'll be times where I'll be done with the lab pretty quick. So, I appreciate Kathy, making changes here, but I'm still fine with the last Monday of the month if everybody else is.
But we can do a doodle poll, and I can suggest Monday or Wednesday as the two best dates. I know you guys like Thursdays. I have to tell you, my Thursday every other week is packed. So that's why I've been kind of pushing away on Thursdays. You want to stick with afternoons, and anybody want me to add evenings to it, or just afternoons? Just afternoons, okay. Anything else you guys want to clear up before, like, it's already 3:55? John, do you want to have any last thoughts, or do you want to just work together with the steering group on planning the next meeting? How do you guys feel? I'm getting a lot of shaked heads, so I think we're working together as a steering group to plan the next meeting.
Well, let me make a suggestion, going back to something that Eric said, and then Jay put something in the chat too, is to me, talking to this group, but talking to some other groups as well, I think the point that you brought up in terms of the citizen science of some very simple online data entry is hugely important going forward, whether it's for breeding birds or beached birds or any of the kinds of things that we're all involved with. You know, many of the groups are using very complex systems, whether it's eBirds or 123 Survey or these other sorts of things that are great for the professional biologists, but just are not user friendly.
You know what? I'm going to have to call you on that, Mark, because eBird has increased tenfold, if not more, in Canada during the pandemic. And there's a lot of people who use it who I would have said in the past are not user friendly. So I'm not willing to say it's not. Is it appropriate for loons? Well, they all say right on it that it's not appropriate for reproductive success work. It's a checklist. Yeah. It's complicated. Having somebody who's going through it with multiple programs right now, and Nancy can talk to you about this, it's very complicated coming up to having data entry that's secure data entry. And you have to have both, especially when you're starting to cross borders. And that's the biggest thing. So I agree with you. It's an absolute point. I don't agree that you need it first. I think what you need first, and others may disagree with me on that, you have to know your variables you want to collect.
Yeah.
Figure out your survey design and then figure out your portal.
Okay.
Yeah. If you go in there without that, I'm almost guaranteed that every year you'll be changing your technique, and then people are going to think you're all over the place.
Good discussion to have.
Yeah. So is that something we want to move towards, that discussion already, or do we want to stick with the path that we've started?
Well, I think it's good that we stick to the path, but I was just thinking, I even put this in the comments, the issue that Eric is currently trying to go through and designing an online survey. It'll be very interesting to see how he does that. And so, not to single out Eric, but it'd be interesting to see what types of inputs we have for him going through this journey as to what data he thinks is going to be most valuable and most reliable in terms of being collected by his citizen science group. And so I don't want to throw Eric under the bus, but I'd be sort of interested to see how he goes through that process and how we can help him. And maybe that in a way can be a way in which we can sort of think about how we can sort of come together as a group and perhaps answer some larger picture questions from all of our different surveys. But
I personally really like what looks like a very easy form for John, which I think is just a quick online field form. My catch is that I wonder how much background work you have to do to clarify the data afterwards. And Nancy also has a really easy one. I think Nancy's is all based on on a coordinates, right?
Yes, Latin long.
Yeah.
At this point. Yeah.
It gets more complicated if you want to permanently connect the person with the site in the system. That's when it gets complicated.
Emily set up a nice survey 123 field form for our field staff and also for our, the loon census, the loon count day, and that both of them I think work pretty well. So we're in the process of looking at that data now.
Yeah, we've committed to another system, and there's pros and cons to doing that. But when you get that many pieces of data heading in one direction, flipping it around to another system is not easy, if even ever possible. Yeah, so we'll stick with the round tables for next time. Yep. Okay. And I think you're right, Mark. I think that's a great topic in the future, but knowing what we want in it is so much more helpful to begin with.
No, I totally agree that, keep going on the content, and then we'll keep, pounding around the edges for, what New York's done, what New Hampshire's done, what the big survey groups, Wisconsin and Canada have done. They'll all kind of answer different questions, but get there.
And Eric, if you ever want to talk databases, feel free to call or Zoom. Okay, so are we done, guys? Are we there?
Kathy, what's the system you're using now?
We use our own system that's part of the Avian Knowledge Network. And I believe the background is SQL, but don't quote me on that. I'm not a programmer. We have, I think, 5 programmers on staff right now. But if you know the Avian Knowledge Network portals, they're very much a checklist system as well. They're not great for reproductive data. And so a program like the Loon survey doesn't fit well. It's kind of like putting a square peg in a round hole. And the only reason I can use that for the Loon survey, and I really like the way it works for our Loon survey because it looks just like my data form, is because we have some exceptionally talented programmers who built it to match exactly what I want. And we do make that system available to other, and I think the US portal, which is out of the West Coast, also makes the system available to others. But it's not directly designed like that. So I have to have a lot of back doors to get at the data, and I have to have some computer skills to work it, which I do because I don't want to handle data anymore. I hate data anymore, but I started in data management. So everybody's laughing. Yeah, 30 years of data is enough. But it works quite well. I really like the way we're doing the Atlas stuff, and I think that's a wonderful tool for loon surveyors in the future. I'm so excited about seeing range shifts and things like that. If we have 4 atlases going, or just knowing what's happening with loons in Newfoundland, like that's in itself quite cool. Because we just don't have that knowledge. Yeah.
You should know, by the way, Kathy, that in 1605, Samuel de Champlain reported loons off the south coast of Newfoundland in May.
And what did he call them?
Divers.
Of course, because he's from, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, and I'm sure the Vikings found them off the coast of Newfoundland.
I'm sure they did, yeah.
600 years earlier.
Yeah.
Sure, they tasted a little fishy.
Okay, so I think we're done, guys. Does anybody want to add anything else? All right.
Kathy, I will try and write up a few of the questions, or as many of them as I've gotten jotted down here, and it's part of a good discussion. Thanks.
I will send you my notes as well, though, but like I just typed as I went, so that's pretty. Expect errors. Okay. All right, we'll do. All right.
Thank
See
you.
y'all later. All right.
All right.
Thanks again, John.
Hi, guys.
Thanks so much, John. It was amazing. Really,
Yes.
really enjoyed
It was really good.